On May 16, 1903, at 8:05 in the evening, the exact minute the sun went down, 250,000 electric light bulbs switched on at once over a sandbar at the edge of Brooklyn. Not gradually, not in sections. On a single throw of a switch, timed to the second the sky went dark. 60,000 people stood on the sand to watch it happen. 60,000 people who had grown up reading by gaslight and walking home by lantern, now watching towers and minarets catch fire with electricity in one continuous instant. 12 months earlier, that same ground had been open sand and the remains of a failed amusement park. Today, the tallest structure still standing on that stretch of boardwalk is a rusted steel tower. 250 feet of scaffolding built for a World's Fair and moved to the site afterward. It has not carried a single passenger since 1968. The city keeps it upright as a landmark. Nobody rides it. This is the story of the sandbar that lit itself up brighter than anything else in America and spent the following century finding out what happens to a place once the lights start going out, one section at a time. Chapter 1. The Rabbit Island. Before it had hotels or piers or a single paved street, the sandbar at the southern edge of Brooklyn had rabbits, thousands of them, working the dune grass and the marsh edges in numbers dense enough that the Dutch who first mapped the place gave it a name for exactly what they saw: Coney Island, Island of Rabbits. English settlers flattened Coney into Coney, and the Coney stuck. It remains the leading explanation historians offer for the name, ahead of a handful of weaker rivals that never gathered the same weight of evidence. The rabbits are long gone. The name outlived them by centuries. For most of that time, the island was barely an island anyone bothered to visit. A tidal creek and a belt of salt marsh cut it off from the rest of Long Island, and the only way across was a rough causeway that flooded twice a day with the tide. There was no reason to cross it. There was sand, dune grass, and rabbits, and nothing a Brooklyn farmer needed badly enough to risk wet boots for. The first regular break in that isolation came by water, not by road. A small steamboat named the Iolas began the run from the Battery in 1845, carrying a trickle of passengers to open beach and nothing else. It was not yet a resort. It was barely a destination. The first building meant to keep a visitor overnight went up 16 years before that steamboat ever ran. In 1829, a hotel called the Coney Island House opened near what is now Sea Gate, on the island's western end, plain, wooden, and functionally alone on a beach that had no other structure worth the name. It stood through the 1830s and 1840s as something closer to an outpost than a resort, reachable only by the causeway or a private boat, serving a handful of guests a season. The island's real transformation into a destination was still decades off. For now it was one building on an empty beach, and the only way in still depended on the tide. What did depend on the tide was the causeway, and by the 1860s, Brooklyn had the money and the appetite to replace it. In 1860, a horse-drawn line began running passengers to a terminal near Van Sicklen's, the island's first railroad, however modest. The Brooklyn, Bath, and Coney Island Railroad reached Bath Beach in 1864 and pushed its track the rest of the way to Coney Island by 1867. The Prospect Park and Coney Island Railroad, known to riders as the Culver Line, opened in 1875, running straight to a terminal at Culver Plaza near Surf Avenue. The Brooklyn, Flatbush, and Coney Island Railroad started service on July 2, 1878, and the New York and Sea Beach Railroad followed within that same stretch of years. By the end of the 1870s, more railroad companies were competing for that strip of sand than there were hotels standing on it. The rabbits, if any were left, had nowhere quiet to go. The rail lines needed something to connect to on the waterside, and in 1879, the New York and Sea Beach Railroad built it, a pier of iron and wood running 1,000 to 1,300 feet straight out into the ocean, wide enough to carry 2 covered promenade decks and 3 pagoda-roofed pavilions, one of them holding a restaurant, a ballroom, and a theater seating 2,500 people. A second iron pier went up several hundred feet to the east not long after. 2 years later, in 1881, the Iron Steamboat Company put 7 all-iron ferries into service between Manhattan and the piers, each one named for a constellation: Cygnus, Cepheus, Cetus, Pegasus, Perseus, Sirius, Taurus. The company ran those 7 steamboats for more than 50 years, into 1932. By the early 1880s, the island that had once required a rowboat and a strong stomach to reach was arriving by rail from 4 directions and by iron steamer besides. Getting there was no longer the problem. What Brooklyn had not planned for was who would show up once it was easy: the sharpers, the saloon men, and the ward bosses who looked at an unincorporated beach with no real government and understood exactly what it was worth. That understanding was about to have a name. Chapter 2: The Lawless Kingdom. That understanding had a name, and the first one to wear it was Michael Norton, a Tammany Hall ward heeler known along the waterfront as Thunderbolt. Norton claimed the island's western tip for himself sometime in the 1860s, and the strip of sand that took his name, Norton's Point, answered to no charter, no municipal police, and no landlord but Norton. Card sharps ran 3-card Monte on tables set up in the open. Saloons operated without license because there was no office to license them. Brothels operated the same way. Political gangs from across the East River came out to drink, gamble, and fight. Nobody arrived to stop them. Norton had already made sure of that. Norton had built the model in miniature, a beach that ran on private arrangement instead of public law. Enter John Y. McCain. McCain was a Gravesend-born carpenter who had never held elected office of any kind until 1868, when the town voted him in as its 3rd constable, a minor post, the kind of job nobody else wanted. McCain did not stay minor for long. He became a town commissioner within a year, doubling the town's rental income before most residents noticed he'd been given the job. In 1873, he renegotiated the lease on Coney Island Point itself, and the town's annual rent on that beach jumped from $400 to $6,100, collected by a government that answered only to him. He became supervisor within a decade. And when the state legislature created a police department for Gravesend in 1881, McCain appointed himself chief, unsalaried and unaccountable to anyone above him. None of this required an election McCain could lose. He controlled the police, he controlled the licenses, he controlled the courts that were supposed to be watching him. Coney Island in these years was not a place without law. It only looked that way from Manhattan. It had a government. The government simply worked for one man, and the one man had built it himself, office by office, the same way Norton had built his shore, not by breaking the law, but by becoming, in every practical sense, the law. By the late 1880s, McCain had stopped operating alone. In 1887, he allied himself with Hugh McLaughlin, the boss who ran the Democratic machine across all of Brooklyn, and the alliance gave McCain's private government a patron with reach far beyond Gravesend's town line. The following year, in the 1888 presidential election, McCain's operation produced votes for Benjamin Harrison under names pulled from the local cemetery. Nobody in Gravesend cast those ballots because nobody in Gravesend was left to cast them. By 1893, the machine had turned that private government into an industry running at full capacity. Town election rolls that year listed 6,218 registered voters in a town with perhaps 1,500 actual residents, thousands of names that existed only on paper, voting only on McCain's schedule. That November, when a sheriff arrived at the Gravesend Town Hall with a court injunction ordering McCain to let Republican election observers inside, McCain met him at the door with a line that outlived him. Injunctions, don't go here. The sheriff left without his observers. The line reached a grand jury before the year was out. McCain was indicted, tried in Brooklyn Supreme Court, and on February 19, 1894, convicted of election fraud and sentenced to 6 years of hard labor at Sing Sing. His deputies received lighter terms. That April, the New York State Legislature folded Gravesend and Coney Island into the city of Brooklyn, erasing the independent township McCain had spent 26 years turning into his own. He served roughly 4 years before his release and died in 1899. He outlived the kingdom by 5 years. McCain's kingdom had run on ballots that didn't exist and a police force that answered to nobody but him. At the other end of the same stretch of sand, a very different kind of power was already taking shape, one that would need no injunctions and no armed men at a town hall door, because it intended simply to buy the ground outright. It did not have a name yet. It was about to. Chapter 3: The Grand Hotels. It did not have a name yet. It was about to. The name was Austin Corbin, a Wall Street banker and railroad man who had spent the 1870s stitching together the rail lines running toward the island's eastern shore, and who understood in a way McCain never had to, that a coastline could be sold as easily as it could be policed. In 1877, Corbin bought roughly 500 acres of open dune east of West Brighton for something close to $1,500, $3 an acre, in a deal that McCain had helped arrange. The man who had spent a decade proving Coney Island answered to no one had just handed its eastern half to a banker with a railroad. Corbin built fast to keep people apart from everyone else on the beach. The Manhattan Beach Hotel opened on July 4th, 1877. 300 rooms, everyone with a private bathroom, 3 and 4 stories of veranda designed by the architect J. Pickering Putnam, facing the ocean directly. Former President Ulysses Grant spoke at the opening. Corbin gave away the fireworks that night, and the crowd that came to watch grew large enough to overwhelm his own railroad, a resort built on the promise of separation. And its first night was a crush of people his trains could not carry fast enough. 2 more hotels rose along the same stretch within 3 years. The Oriental Hotel opened in August of 1880, another Corbin property, pitched further up market than its neighbor. To the west stood the Brighton Beach Hotel, open since 1878 and named for the Brooklyn statesman Henry C. Murphy, who had helped bring the railroad to that stretch of sand. Between them, Coney Island's eastern shore now sold a version of the seaside that had nothing to do with the card tables of Norton's Point, 4 miles to the west, verandas instead of saloons, a different island built on the same sand. The ocean did not respect the distinction. By the mid-1880s, the beach in front of the Brighton Beach Hotel was eroding fast enough that the owners faced a choice: lose the building to the Atlantic or move it. In April of 1888, they moved it. Engineers raised the entire structure, 5,000 tons of it, 460 feet long by 150 feet wide, on 13 hydraulic jacks, laid 24 sets of rail track beneath it, 1.5 miles of steel, and lowered the whole building onto 112 railroad flat cars. 6 steam locomotives pulled it. For 9 days, the Brighton Beach Hotel crept inland at a pace slow enough to walk beside, 495 feet, away from the ground the ocean was taking. Guests did not check out for the move. They watched it from the veranda, the way guests watch weather. It stands, by every account since, as the largest building relocation of the 19th century. Money on that scale drew more than hotel guests. By 1880, 3 racetracks operated near the hotels. Sheepshead Bay, built that year by the Coney Island Jockey Club, founded by Leonard Jerome and William K. Vanderbilt, the only track in the country running both a dirt oval and an English turf course. Brighton Beach Race Course, opened in 1879, by the same men who owned the hotel beside it. And Gravesend opened in 1886 by the Brooklyn Jockey Club, on ground that had recently answered to McCain alone. Together, the three tracks made Coney Island, for 2 decades, the horse racing capital of the United States, a title the state legislature would end in 1908 when it outlawed betting outright and left all 3 grandstands empty within 2 years. But racing and a hotel on rails were never the whole story of what this shore could sell. Manhattan Beach and Brighton Beach had built their fortunes on distance. Private verandas, ticketed grandstands, a mile of open sand between their guests, and the crowd arriving by the trainload at the island's western end. 4 miles down that same beach, a boy who had once sold sifted sand in cardboard boxes for a quarter had grown into a young man with the opposite idea. He did not want to keep the crowd out. He wanted to sell it a ticket in. Chapter 4. Steeplechase. He wanted to sell a ticket in, and the boy who would build that idea into a park had been selling something on this same beach 21 years earlier. George Cornelius Tillieu was born in New York in 1862 and moved to Coney Island at 3 when his father, Peter Tillieu, opened a restaurant and hotel called the Surf House on the same beach that would later answer to Norton and McCain. By 1876, at 14, George was working the beach himself, packing boxes of sifted sand and bottles of ocean water, 25 cents apiece, sold to visitors who wanted a souvenir of the sand they were already standing on. He cleared $13.45 on his first day. It was not much of a fortune. It was, in miniature, the business he would spend the next 30 years perfecting, charge people for what was already theirs, and make them glad to pay for it. By 1882, he and his father had opened Tillieu's Surf Theater, the first theater on Coney Island, a modest wooden hall where the entertainment was, occasionally, more than the ocean itself. Tillieu spent the 1880s buying up beachfront lots one at a time, the way a man buys land when he suspects correctly that it is about to become valuable. In 1893, he married Mary O'Donnell, and the couple honeymooned in Chicago at the World's Columbian Exposition. He came home to a beach that Corbin had already turned into verandas and fences. Tillieu answered the fence with a turnstile. In 1897, he opened Steeplechase Park on 15 acres at the west end of Bowery Street, 2/3 of it land he already owned outright, and at its center he placed a ride built to look like a horse race and run like nothing anyone downtown had seen. Wooden and steel horses, riders astride them, gliding along undulating steel rails at the pull of gravity alone. There was no grandstand to watch from a distance. There was a ticket booth, and past it, a park. Tillieu gave the place a face to match, a grinning, gap-toothed mask with a jaw wide enough to swallow the boardwalk, nicknamed Tilly after its creator, mounted over the entrance so that every visitor walked into Steeplechase Park through an enormous painted grin. It would outlast the park that made it famous and become before long the closest thing Coney Island had to a coat of arms. A few hundred feet from where Tillieu raised his gate, something else had already burned. Between 1885 and 1896, a 7-story hotel, shaped like an elephant, tin-skinned and enormous, had stood over that stretch of Surf Avenue. 31 rooms inside its body, a cigar stand in one front leg, a spiral staircase climbing a hind one, and by 1890 a reputation as something closer to a brothel than a hotel. On September 27, 1896, it burned to the ground in a fire people swore they could see across the water in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Tillieu opened his own park on that same stretch of sand the following year. No one thought to read it as a warning. The warning came anyway, on July 29, 1907, when fire broke out inside the Cave of the Winds attraction and swept through Steeplechase within hours. Most of the park Tillieu had built over 10 years was gone by sunrise. The mechanical horses, the halls, The painted grin over the gate, all of it ash and standing frames. As Coney Island lore has always told it, till you was back at the smoking entrance before the embers cooled, a hand-lettered sign nailed to the gate, troubles yesterday he no longer had, troubles today he hadn't had yesterday, and admission to the burning ruins, 10 cents. Whether he said it exactly that way, or the story improved itself with retelling, the instinct behind it was real. He had never once, in 30 years, stopped charging admission. By the following season, the park was rebuilt, and by 1909 it stood fully restored around a new centerpiece, the Pavilion of Fun, 5 acres of steel and glass raised where the wooden halls had burned. A roof built this time to keep the fire out rather than the crowd. Down the beach, 2 showmen who had first crossed paths at an exposition in Buffalo were already unloading something brighter than anything Tillieu had built. A park with no gate shaped like a face, and no need for one. Chapter 5, Luna Park. Frederick Thompson and Elmer "Skip" Dundee had not started out as partners. They met as rivals in 1901, competing midway showmen at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, each running his own attraction against the others for the same nightly crowds. Thompson's was called A Trip to the Moon, a mechanical airship named Luna that rocked and shuddered through a painted lunar sky toward a cast of costumed moon dwellers, sold not as a ride, but as a voyage, ticket included. It outdrew everything else on the Midway. Visitors left the fairground still talking about it, which was exactly what Thompson had built it to do. Dundee, watching another man's line grow longer than his own, did not sue him or copy him. He proposed a partnership instead. Between them, they raised $700,000 to bring the idea to Coney Island, a figure they advertised to the New York press as a full $1 million. Tillieu had built his fortune on a turnstile and the pull of gravity, 1 nickel at a time. Thompson and Dundee built theirs on wattage instead. Where Steeplechase sold motion, Luna Park was going to sell light itself as the attraction. The ground they leased was not empty. 3 years earlier, it had opened as Sea Lion Park, a saltwater attraction that had already failed once under its previous owner. Thompson and Dundee took the site anyway, tore down what remained of it, and started raising towers, minarets, and 250,000 electric bulbs on ground that had already buried 1 amusement park underneath it. Before any of that opened to the public, the same ground hosted something else. Owners had first announced a public hanging, staged for a paying crowd, until the ASPCA objected to the method. On January 4th, 1903, 4 months before the gates opened, a circus elephant named Topsy was killed there instead, fed carrots laced with cyanide, and then wired to a generator, and killed with 6,600 volts in front of roughly 1,500 people gathered at the fence, and some 200 more, spectators and press photographers, let in close enough to film it. Popular memory has spent more than a century blaming Thomas Edison for the switch. He never attended. He never touched a wire. The war of the currents he had fought against alternating current had ended a decade earlier, and the confusion traces only to a Brooklyn power company that carried his name on its letterhead, and to a film credited on screen to a production company that carried the same 3 words. Luna Park did not have a name yet when Topsy died. It would not open for another 4 months. It opened on May 16, 1903, timed to the second the sun went down, 8:05 in the evening. 250,000 electric light bulbs switched on across the towers and minarets at once, every dome and archway and ride outlined in fire, and 60,000 people standing on the sand watched a park built over a dead elephant and a bankrupt predecessor announce itself as Electric Eden. A Trip to the Moon, the attraction that had started all of it in Buffalo, anchored the Midway. Beside it ran War of the Worlds, a 25-cent naval spectacle staging miniature European fleets against a mocked-up New York harbor. One of the most expensive tickets on the grounds, and one of the most popular. The crowds did not thin after opening night. By the 1904 season, Luna Park was drawing 90,000 paying visitors on its best single days. Not the million a later Coney Island would claim for itself, but still more than most American downtowns saw across an entire week. The light bulb count kept climbing behind it season after season, past the number that had stunned the crowd on opening night. Down the beach, on ground nobody had built on yet, a real estate man named William Reynolds was already drawing up something of his own, on a scale that made Luna Park's opening night lamp count look modest by comparison. Within a year, next door to Luna Park's electric towers, something taller and whiter would rise out of the same sand, built by a man who had watched the crowds and decided electricity was not yet finished being sold. Chapter 6. Dreamland. What Reynolds had planned turned out to be the largest amusement build Coney Island had yet seen. He had been a New York State Senator a decade earlier, and through the 1890s he built one speculative block of Brooklyn at a time. More than 1,000 houses raised in Borough Park by 1898 sold before the framing was finished. Dreamland opened on May 14, 1904, a year almost to the week after Luna Park, built in under 6 months for $3,500,000. Where Luna Park had gone up in color, Dreamland went up in white. Towers, domes, plaster minarets. Every one of them was painted the same unbroken white, so that after dark, lit from beneath, the whole park read less like a fairground than a city carved out of something colder than paint. A central tower rose over the entrance, taller than anything Thompson and Dundee had built next door, meant to announce the park before a visitor reached the gate. Luna Park had sold light as spectacle. Dreamland sold it as architecture. Behind the white towers, Reynolds built a city inside the city. Lilliputian was a half-scale replica town, a walled quarter measuring 80 by 175 feet, populated by roughly 300 little people, recruited from circuses and World's Fair sideshows, complete with its own council and its own fire department. A brigade that turned out on the hour to put out small blazes staged purely for the crowd. On a busy weekend, 20,000 people came through Lilliputia's gates to watch a government in scale. Samuel Gumpertz ran it for Reynolds and ran it well enough that within 2 years, Reynolds had put him in charge of the entire park. Elsewhere on the grounds, a physician named Martin County ran a premature infant incubator exhibit, part medical ward, part sideshow. He ran the Dreamland exhibit from its opening in 1904 until the fire that ended it in 1911. 7 years. One of 2 incubator shows he ran at once, the other next door at Luna Park. Over the full span of his career, he treated more than 8,000 premature infants and saved an estimated 6,500 of them, charging admission the entire time to a public that came, mostly, out of curiosity. The fire started at 1:30 in the morning on May 27, 1911, in the Hell Gate boat ride, where workmen were finishing roof repairs ahead of the coming season. The lights strung up for the job had been shorting and popping in the dark for hours. In that dark, a workman knocked over a bucket of hot roofing tar, and Hell Gate went up around him. The park's towers were plaster and lath, built to look permanent while weighing almost nothing, and none of it slowed the fire down. It burned for 2.5 to 3.5 hours, not the single hour that later legend would settle on, until there was no more park left to burn. Near Hell Gate, Bostock's animal show lost its cages within minutes. Black Prince, a 3-year-old lion, broke loose with his mane already on fire and ran into the street outside the park, where he was shot 24 times before he fell. Inside the incubator building, 6 infants were carried out wrapped in blankets. All 6 survived the night that killed the park around them. By morning, Dreamland itself was gone, and so were roughly 200 buildings in the 4 blocks around it. Hotels, restaurants, shooting galleries. With $5,200,000 in property lost and more than 2,500 people out of work, 1,600 of them from Dreamland alone. Not the White Towers, not the central tower at the gate, not Lilliputia's little parliament and its toy fire brigade. Reynolds never rebuilt. The land sat behind a fence for years, and the age of 3 competing parks, each trying to outbuild the other in light and plaster, ended in the wreckage of the one that had gone furthest. The crowds that had come for Steeplechase's horses and Luna Park's towers and Dreamland's white gate were about to grow larger than any of the 3 men who built those parks had imagined, not from another park but from underneath the street. The city still had a nickel left to spend. Chapter 7. The Nickel Empire. The city still had a nickel left to spend, and on May 1st, 1920, it found somewhere to spend it. The Culver Line's final stretch into Coney Island opened that day, folding the resort into the city subway system outright and killing off the old double fare that had made the trip cost twice what a ride to anywhere else in Brooklyn cost. The fare from Manhattan dropped from 10 cents to 5 in a single afternoon. Coney Island had always been close. Now, for the first time, it was cheap. Within a few summers, holiday crowds of up to 1 million people were arriving on a single warm Sunday. Sun-starved commuters who could suddenly afford the trip more than once a season. The decade that followed took its name from that one coin, the Nickel Empire. What 5 cents bought on the right afternoon was a crowd beyond anything Thompson or Reynolds had drawn at the height of their electric towers. On July 29, 1940, during a heat wave that held the city past 100 degrees for days running, an estimated 1,400,000 people packed onto the beach in a single afternoon. The largest crowd Coney Island's own police captain said he had ever seen, on a beach built 4 decades earlier, to hold a fraction of that number comfortably. The subway did not just deliver the crowd. It built new things for the crowd to stand under. On May 30th, 1920, Memorial Day, the Wonder Wheel opened on the sand off Surf Avenue. A steel Ferris wheel 150 feet tall and 200 tons of steel. Its 24 cars split between 16 that slid on curved rails as the wheel turned and 8 that stayed still. 3 years later, on May 15th, 1923, the boardwalk opened its first stretch, 80 feet wide, laid over 120,000 tons of stone, $3 million spent to give the crowd somewhere solid to stand between the ocean and the rides. Brooklyn called it Coney Island's Fifth Avenue. For a nickel fare, all of it was open to anyone who could reach a turnstile. Somewhere in that crowd, back in 1916, a Polish immigrant named Nathan Handwerker had already placed his own bet on the nickel. Handwerker had spent his first years on the island working the counter at Feltman's, the beer garden a few blocks off the beach that called itself, without much argument from anyone, the largest restaurant in the world. 5,250,000 visitors a year, each one paying a dime for a hot dog. Handwerker opened his own stand nearby and sold the same hot dog for a nickel, half the price, and hired men in white doctor's coats to eat at his counter in plain view, to reassure customers who doubted a 5-cent franc could be safe to swallow. Feltman's kept its dime. Handwerker's stand kept growing. The Cyclone arrived next, on June 26, 1927. A wooden coaster built for a sum historians still argue over, somewhere near $175,000. It dropped 58 degrees on its first hill and hit 60 miles an hour before the ride was half over, for a ticket that cost 25 cents on weekdays and 35 on Sundays and holidays. It held the title of fastest roller coaster in the world for the next 49 years. 14 years later, in 1941, a steel tower arrived from Flushing Meadows. It had been built for the World's Fair of 1939. 250 feet of scaffolding meant to stand for a single season, and when the fair closed, the men who ran Steeplechase Park bought it for $150,000, moved it to the boardwalk, and reopened it as the parachute jump. For now, it was simply the tallest thing on the beach, one more ride a nickel could buy a look at. By the early 1940s, the nickel empire looked permanent. The wheel turning, the boardwalk full, the fare still 5 cents. It had not been built to last. It had been built to stay full only as long as the fare held and the technology behind it stayed exactly as it was. And neither one of those conditions was going to hold for very much longer. Chapter 8. The Long Retreat. Neither one held for long, and the first to go was Luna Park itself. On August 12, 1944, fire broke out, somewhere in the park's scenic railway on West 12th Street. The cause was never established. And within hours, it had taken 90% of the park. 800,000 people watched the glow from the beach, the same beach that had once watched the park light itself in a single instant. The damage came to $500,000. The western half never reopened. What remained of the eastern half limped on in pieces through the 1946 season and no further. That August of 1946, new owners bought the wreckage and announced plans to clear it for veterans' housing. Demolition began that October, and before the crews finished the job, the site burned a second time. 2 fires in 26 months. What was left afterward was flattened and fenced, and it stayed that way for years. Luna Park's fires were not the only force working against the resort in those years. The arrangement that had built the nickel empire, a 5-cent fare and nothing better to do on a hot afternoon, was coming apart from underneath. A private automobile went wherever its owner pointed it, not wherever a subway line happened to run, and the GI Bill put that automobile within reach of more families every year, along with a reason to drive past Coney Island toward beaches with fewer crowds and more parking. At home, an air conditioner and a television did the rest of the work. One kept a family cool without a subway ride at all. The other gave them something to watch without ever leaving the sofa. Coney Island had spent 50 years selling relief from a hot apartment. By the 1950s, the apartment could cool itself and entertain itself besides. Robert Moses had been circling the beach since 1938, when a change to the city charter put Coney Island's sand under the Parks Department he ran. He had spent 2 decades building quiet, grass-lined parks across Long Island and had no patience left over for what Tillieu or Thompson had built on this one. Moses wanted open sand and quiet, passive recreation in his own phrase, not a boardwalk crowded with vendors and rides. He posted the rules himself: no hawkers, bonfires, bicycles, roller skates, or sitting on the boardwalk railings. In 1953, he proposed something larger, asking the City Planning Commission to rezone the amusement district for housing, to push the boardwalk 300 feet inland, and to trade direct rail access for parking lots built for cars. The same cars now carrying families past Coney Island toward beaches Moses preferred. Concessionaires and residents fought the rezoning hard enough that the Board of Estimate backed off, restoring a protected strip for rides between West 22nd and West 8th Streets. It was a delay, not a defeat. Moses had already moved against the neighborhood behind the beach. In 1949, he declared the west end of Coney Island an urban renewal area and cleared it under the power of eminent domain, block by block. Gravesend houses opened in 1954. Coney Island houses followed in 1957, 5 towers rising between West 29th and West 32nd Streets. By the time the wave of building finished, roughly 9,000 new apartments stood where a working-class neighborhood used to be. Fire had already shown Coney Island what it looked like to lose a quarter of itself at once, in 1911 and again in 1944. It would happen again in 1963 and then again after that. Block by block, the old neighborhood kept disappearing, to flame or to the wrecking ball, and it was rarely obvious which one was doing more of the work. By the mid-1950s, of the 3 parks that had once competed for the same electric skyline, only one still had its gates open. Dreamland had never come back after 1911. Luna Park was 2 fires and an empty lot. Steeplechase alone kept running, Tilly's grinning face still bolted over the entrance, doing the same business it had done since 1897, while new apartment towers rose 2 blocks inland, and the neighborhood around it turned over. It was not going to last forever either. The only question left was who would come for the land underneath it. Chapter 9. The Demolition Party. Who would come for the land underneath Steeplechase turned out at first to be no one at all. The park simply stopped. On September 20th, 1964, it closed for what everyone assumed was the usual off-season. No notice on the gate, no farewell in the papers, Tilly's mechanical horses locked in place under a roof that had outlasted 3 other Coney Island fortunes. The silence lasted 5 months. By February of 1965, word moved along the boardwalk that the land was for sale, and that July 1st, a Brooklyn developer named Fred Trump paid $2,500,000 for 15 acres that had been selling amusement since the 1890s. Trump did not want a park. He wanted the view, and he told the papers he intended to put luxury apartment towers where the horses had run. The Coney Island Chamber of Commerce objected. Nobody with the power to stop him did. The towers needed 2 years of paperwork before they needed a single brick laid, and Trump filled the waiting with a party. On September 21st, 1966, almost 2 years to the day after Steeplechase closed its gates for the last time, he opened the Pavilion of Fun to a crowd in evening wear. Champagne moved through the ruins on trays. Models in bikinis worked the room between the rusting Cave of the Winds and the ticket booths nobody had staffed in 2 seasons. At the center of it all stood the stained glass funny face, the grinning gap-toothed mask that had greeted every visitor through Steeplechase's gate since 1897. Trump handed his guests bricks and asked them to throw. The glass came apart under a crowd throwing it for sport, to applause, with a band playing somewhere behind the noise. Some accounts have him selling the bricks rather than giving them away. Either way, the mascot of Coney Island's oldest surviving park went out to the sound of glasses clinking. It bought him nothing. The rezoning Trump needed for his towers never cleared the city's planning process. And the 15 acres he had paid for sat behind a chain-link fence instead of rising into apartments. New York City bought the land back from him for $4 million, partly with federal money, and got, in exchange for its trouble, an empty lot where a park used to be. Trump had smashed the glass to clear the way for something the city itself made sure never got built. What replaced Steeplechase was not luxury housing. It was the rest of Coney Island, arriving at the same moment from a different direction. Redlining had already choked off mortgages and fire insurance for the homeowners around the boardwalk, mostly Jewish, Italian, and Irish families. And landlords with nothing left to lose from a vacant building found arsonists willing to make one for them. The fires that had gutted Dreamland in 1911 and finished off Luna Park in 1944 kept coming after that, 1963 and years beyond it, until by 1975 the New York Times was describing entire stretches of the neighborhood as a war zone. Gangs with names like the Jokers, the Homicides, and the 7 Immortals filled the vacant lots the fires left behind. In 1967, Mayor John Lindsay had already declared the whole west end of Coney Island a poverty area, on paper, which changed nothing about what was happening to it in practice. One gate on the beach never went dark. Astroland had opened in 1962, 2 years before Steeplechase even closed. The company behind it, founded in 1955 by Dewey Albert and a handful of partners that included Nathan Handwerker himself, under a space-age theme they had first planned to call Wonderland. It grew to roughly 36 rides at its peak, and in 1975, with the wrecking ball already scheduled for the Cyclone, Astroland's owners bought the ride and kept it running. Everything around it was burning or falling down. Astroland kept selling tickets. Some nights, walking that stretch of boardwalk past the fenced lots and the boarded rooming houses, the only light for blocks came from one small gate. The same one, lit again the next night, and the night after that. Chapter 10. The Lights Come Back On. That gate stayed lit through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s, the last amusement business standing on a boardwalk that had lost nearly everything else to fire, flight, and the wrecking ball. Then in 2001, a second set of lights came back a few blocks away. Keyspan Park opened that year on the old Steeplechase ground the city had reclaimed from Fred Trump decades earlier after his apartment towers never rose. Where Tilly's mechanical horses had once circled that same dirt, batters now stood in the box under stadium lights, 6,500 seats facing the boardwalk. Professional baseball returned to Brooklyn for the first time since the Dodgers left in 1957, and the new minor league team took the field under the name Cyclones, borrowed from the wooden coaster still running 2 blocks off, the same coaster that had already outlived the park it was named after. Astroland's own gate stayed open 7 more years, and then it went to a buyer too. On November 28, 2006, the Albert family sold the site to a real estate firm called Thor Equities for $30 million. Thor priced its own redevelopment plan at $1.5 billion and built none of it. Astroland closed for good on September 7, 2008. The last working gate on a block it had held since 1962, finally going dark, along with the rest of it. The land did not stay dark long. On February 16, 2010, the city announced a 10-year lease of that same ground to Central Amusement International, the American arm of an Italian ride manufacturer named Zamperla. The lease ran 10 years, renewable, a temporary arrangement for what had once been permanent ground. The new park opened in just 100 days, built on 3.16 acres of former Astroland, a fraction of the 15 acres George Tilly had once fenced off for Steeplechase, back when 15 acres of sand was still considered an opening bid. It took the name Luna Park, borrowed from the towers and minarets that had burned there in 1944, and stood roughly where those towers once stood. The survivors began collecting protected status of their own, one at a time. The Cyclone became a city landmark in 1988. The Wonder Wheel followed on May 23, 1989, the same day the parachute jump finally did too, after a 1977 designation that was rescinded within the year over doubts about the tower's structural integrity, restored through the National Register in 1980, and confirmed as a city landmark 9 years after that, on the same afternoon as the wheel next door. That wheel had changed hands only once in its entire history, from the Garms family, who ran it for its first 6 decades, to the Vorderies family, who bought it on June 7, 1983, and run it still. The boardwalk itself became a scenic landmark on May 15, 2018, exactly 95 years to the calendar day, after it first opened on May 15, 1923. 4 separate structures on one boardwalk now carried the same legal protection the city gives its churches and courthouses. Nathan's had built a myth of its own by then. The eating contest advertised itself as unbroken since 1916, the same year Handworker opened his counter, until the contest's own longtime promoter, Mortimer Matz, admitted in 2010 that the origin story had been invented for the newspapers. The real contest began around 1972 when the winner ate 12 hot dogs in 5 minutes. The record now stands at 76. A few blocks down the boardwalk, the Mermaid Parade, started in 1983 by the artist Dick Zigen, draws crowds counted in the hundreds of thousands each June, though no 2 sources agree on exactly how many. Every one of those acres still runs on the same clock it always has. Hot dog counters, ticket booths, a parade every June. The small machinery of the resort keeps turning beneath the landmarks. The Cyclone still climbs its first hill every summer weekend. The Wonder Wheel still turns under the same family that has run it for more than 40 years. The parachute jump still stands over all of it, lit every night. A landmark nobody is permitted to tear down, and nobody has ridden since 1968. Nobody rides it. The lights come on anyway, over the same stretch of sand every evening, without fail.